Lots of people have pets. More have at least interacted with animals at some point. They are ubiquitous in our lives in many ways, as livestock, as companions, and as cohabitants of the earth. Children grow up memorizing species names, enthralled by the abundant ecological variety offered by the world into which they've been born. Darwin spent years comparing their similarities and revolutionized the scientific study of biology with his On the Origins of Species. From this came the very notion of evolution, and with it the concept of a comparative approach to studying naturalistic phenomena. Over 100 years ago, debates raged amongst members of the Linguistic Society of Paris about whether to admit speculative research into the origins of language. No doubt inspired by the influence of Darwin and the progress of historical linguistics during the Victorian era, many rushed at the chance to make proposals about what we might call Proto-Indo-European. In their attempts, scholars often employed the comparative method, using historical sources of various languages to cross-reference lexical or grammatical similarities and track common ancestors through language families. These approaches certainly offer utility in helping to understand the evolution of languages. But what about language itself, as a singular concept? We could trace linguistic patterns through ancient languages until the evidence runs out, but we would get no closer to knowing the properties of language as something that can experience evolution, that is, as a biological entity. Such issues were ones with which Charles F. Hockett was preoccupied. In 1960, he set about using a similar, comparative method on the fundamental, physical properties of language. And his objects of comparison? Human languages and forms of animal communication. What makes our languages different from those of all other species on Earth? Hockett's analysis first consisted of isolating 13 different characteristics, which he called design features, DFs, of human language. Essentially, they're meant as necessary, but not sufficient, properties. Here is a brief run-through of them all. 1. Vocal auditory channel. Linguistic communication occurs, physically, via vocal outputs and auditory inputs. 2. Rapid fading. A vocal output does not linger around indefinitely for a hearer to pick it up whenever they might wish. 3. Broadcast transmission and directional reception. A vocal output can be heard by anyone within a radius sufficient to pick it up, and its source can often be found by locating a direction from which it came. 4. Interchangeability. An auditory input can be quite easily reproduced by a human as a vocal signal of exactly the same kind. 5. Total feedback. You are able to have complete knowledge of, and can fully analyze, any vocal signal that you produce, because you can hear it too. 6. Specialization. Linguistic signals are specialized to be solely communicative. They don't intend to serve any other biological, adaptive, purpose. 7. Semanticity. There is a specific, intended, signal-to-object link between human language and the things we talk about, rather than any link being accidental or coincidental. 8. Arbitrariness. There is nothing about the signals of human language that indicate the nature of the objects to which they're linked. For example, the word tree doesn't sound like a tree in any way. 9. Discreteness. There are discrete units with which linguistic signals are built up, like phonemes, morphemes, etc. 10. Displacement. Humans can use language to refer to things not present in the immediate vicinity, either in time or space. 11. Productivity. There is an infinite number of possible expressions in human language. 12. Traditional transmission. Knowledge of the specific symbols of a specific language is not innate, and thus neither is the capacity to produce specific linguistic outputs, but, instead, it is taught. 13. Duality of patterning. The discrete units of linguistic signals can be recombined to make new words that are totally unrelated. For example, tack and cat are phonetically the reverse of one another. At face value, this list can come across in a few ways. From one perspective, it certainly appears quite thorough. Hockett arguably does well in his portrayal of language as a system that relies on physical, phonetic phenomena. From another perspective, though, the DFs seem a bit eclectic. One could be forgiven for suggesting that they almost represent a Frankenstein of properties that don't yield a sufficiently holistic picture of language when taken all together. Signed languages, for instance, present a counterexample. According to the DFs, the world's many languages and dialects communicated using what we might call a manual visual channel are overlooked as important in contributing to understanding the physical properties of language, a sentiment reflected in the phonetically inclined wording of many other DFs. Another oversight might be the absence of linguistic features related to social or cultural phenomena. While we must be careful not to criticize Hockett's list for something it does not try to be, we cannot forget that language does not exist in a vacuum. A defining feature of human language that distinguishes it from animals is that it is shaped by the physical contact of human languages whose speakers come into contact borrow sounds and words and concepts such that the languages themselves become more similar. Yet, in many ways, the DFs can receive commendation for their capacity to distinguish human and animal communicative systems. One example Hockett uses to illustrate their effectiveness in doing so is bee dancing. According to Hockett, there are several DFs found in both human languages and the dancing of bees. Also called waggling, this is when a bee, coming home after finding a new source of food, waggles to indicate its distance and direction from the hive, and even wind speed on the journey, to other bees. The audience bees can decode the waggle and then go out to find the new source of food. In this way, their waggling is transmitted as a broadcast, albeit visually, and received from a specific direction, DF2. It can be reproduced by other bees to indicate other sources of food, DF4, which is clearly a form of communication with an intended meaning, DF7. Because the sources of food are never in the hive itself, they are displaced, DF10, and because there could be infinite sources, waggling appears to be productive, DF11. The work of Hockett has not gone without criticism in the half-century period that followed its publication in Scientific American, though he did try to update the original list 6 years later. 6. Some have suggested that the notion of arbitrariness is misguided because linguistic patterns such as the Kiki-Bouba paradigm suggest a certain semantic spikiness, or roundness, to sounds. 7. And also because humans seem to prefer non-arbitrary linguistic symbols in psycholinguistic processing. 8. Others have argued that traditional transmission cannot encapsulate the buildup of, e.g., cultural knowledge that comes with the teaching of linguistic information over generations. 9. Upon reflection, it seems to me that there are two traps inherent to works like Hockett's. The first trap is to even undertake such a research project. Imposing strict, closed, categorical distinctions on a phenomenon so poorly understood, at least, at the time of Hockett's writing, as language is bound to fail. It's almost hubristic to assume sufficient knowledge of language to be able to make such claims, and you will never please everyone. The second trap is to analyze Hockett's work as something more than it was intended by accident. Because it seems so broad in scope, it also appears very easy to poke holes in. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that Hockett's aim was not to provide normative criteria for defining what a language is. Indeed, to assume as much as to strawman the DFs, they do not fail by omitting X or Y or Z if they were never meant to. What makes these design features so fascinating is their ability to connect us with animals, on almost a social level, in a logically plausible way. For all its faults, this zoologically inspired effort to unite our language and bees' waggles is admirable and inspiring. There is widespread us and them-ing about animals amongst humans, and it can often be valid. When our similarities are exaggerated, however, the humbling we humans receive is a sight to behold. Is human language unique?